you can see that better.
Mm-hmm.
I will only be truly content with genuine understanding.
Mm.
Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to see you all. My name is Hal Roth. I direct the Contemplative Studies program here at Brown, and I'd like to welcome you all to this afternoon's seminar, virtual seminar. I want to begin by giving thanks to my colleagues, Ann Hireman Hart and Srinivas Reddy, for their invaluable work in helping to set this up. And of course, special guests to our guest commentators today, Deans Carolyn Jacobs and Oliver Hill. Since many of you may not yet have heard of contemplative studies, it always gives me the opportunity to say a few words about it. And so I'll begin by doing that. We're a relatively new concentration and initiative at Brown, and we've come to serve as a model for many programs across the continent. We approach the study and teaching of contemplative practices and experiences from scientific, humanistic, and artistic epistemologies and perspectives. And what this means is that we study the full range of both intentional and non-intentional contemplative practices from traditional third person and second person perspectives that include the newest scientific research, as well as developing a deep understanding of the cultural and historical context in which these practices have emerged. And in particular, we've also developed an innovative, what we call critical first person perspective, in which we teach contemplative practices in a classroom setting. This leads hopefully to the development of what we call contemplative intelligence, the practical knowledge of how to do contemplative practices, along with the understanding of the various cultural, scientific, and ethical and political contexts through which these practices can be understood. And it's in this last framework that we draw our inspiration for our program today, that we've organized as hopefully a small step in the major struggle that we're facing to confront the systemic racism in our country. The recent events have made us once again only too painfully aware. People often think that contemplatives remain detached from society and either passively or even actively support the status quo. But there's a long tradition of social justice activism among contemplatives. Gandhi, King, Mandela, each in their own way was a contemplative as well as a social activist, and their activist sides are usually more studied and understood. So contemplative practices, we maintain, sustain our bodies and minds in the struggle. Contemplative sciences make these practices available to all people. Contemplative arts directly convey our suffering and joy and provide a vision of our unrealized potential. Contemplative philosophies contextualize our efforts so we never lose our common humanity. Contemplative intelligence maximizes the influence of our efforts while supporting the wisdom and compassion with which we make them. Our commentators today are exemplars of contemplative social activism, each in their own sphere. Professor Carolyn Jacobs is Dean Emerita of the School of Social Work at Smith College, for which she served in that capacity for 14 years. She began when Ruth Simmons was president of Smith, and Ruth, of course, went on to become the best president in the history of Brown University. And if you have not yet heard of Ruth Simmons or don't know Ruth Simmons, please Google her. Professor Oliver Hill is Dean Emeritus of the College of Natural and Health Sciences at Virginia State University and an experimental psychologist of some repute. So we're delighted to welcome our speakers today. So just a final few words about the structure today. Professor Jacobs will speak first, commenting on her lecture here and anything else she wants to do to bring things up to the present. Her lecture was in the spring of 2017. Then Professor Hill, who spoke in the fall of 2017, will also then make some comments on his public lecture and anything else he wants to do to bring things up to today. That will take approximately half an hour. Our moderator for this afternoon is my colleague and friend, Professor Srinivas Reddy. He'll have a couple of questions to put to Professor Jacobs and Professor Hill. We ask that as things are going on, that you put questions into the chat, and we will pick questions out of the chat, call upon you to ask the question of one of our speakers or both of our speakers, and we'll take it from there. If by some strange reason there are no questions in the chat, we'll ask you to use that hand raising feature that you probably all are now familiar with in Zoom from various Zoom meetings and courses and lectures that you have attended previously. So once again, as we always say with these Zoom events, please bear with us. This is kind of a running experiment, and sometimes we have connectivity issues and such things, so please be patient. So without further ado, I will introduce Professor Reddy, who will then introduce our speakers.
Should we just start, Professor Roth?
Yeah, do you have any more words to say, Srini, about?
Nothing, but maybe I thought maybe we just do a 2-minute silent meditation to start. It's a very nice group that we have here together. Some old friends and familiar faces, and also some new friends. So just 2 minutes. In Hindi, we say 2 minute, 2 minutes. This is something that Gandhiji used to do in his prayer meetings all the time. So just 2 minutes of silence, that's it. There's a bell to start and a bell to end. And thank you so much for your presence. Thank you. And now over to Dean Jacobs. Thank you so much. I just saw Carolyn actually speak with the Dalai Lama, so that was just I think last week or not so long ago, and she's also been the interim president of Mind and Life and on the board and deeply connected to that organization, which also has been very intimately connected to contemplative studies. So thank you again, Carolyn Jacobs, Dean, Professor, and friend. So happy to hear what you would like to present to us.
Thank you so much. And I love friend as a part of that. I think in today's world, we are so in need of friends. I thank you, Hal, for inviting me back to reflect on my presentation in 3 years later. I was looking at it, the title was Contemplative Studies Moving Forward During Challenging Times. I think, today I would have said crisis, but I also am very conscious of thinking about, in the sense of the Chinese, there's always that sense of danger and opportunity. And I think contemplative practices for me always keeps us open to the opportunities that may be before us. So as I looked at my presentation from 2017, and I must admit, I rarely go back looking at presentations. I just sort of go, oh, so this was an experience. And I would say that I continue uh, believing deeply that contemplative practices can help us with our feelings of collective anger, grief, and sadness, and the reality of our isolation during COVID-19. I have found that conversations with families, friends, colleagues, and spiritual groups have moved from the overwhelming anxiety of social isolations and fears of contracting COVID-19 to the recent incidents of the murders of African American men and women by police. So while these murders and this pattern has had a long history since slavery, um, we are so much more aware based on the kind of isolation we've been in and the availability of social media, where stories, narratives, any sense of the reality of an event, we used to wait for a newspaper to report it, and then, or a clip on television, and you sort of go, oh, that happened, but did it really? I think the visual of George Floyd, which we watched in so many ways, and then I found myself as an African American woman, I said, I'm going to watch all three funerals because there were very different ones based on uh, being in Minneapolis and then in North Carolinas and then to Houston. But there was that power of homecoming, which is the expression in the African American tradition. It's not just that sense of death, but it's a sense of going home. And yet there's an energy in that that says there's still more work to do and a rededication to that work out of that kind of collective grieving. I think the other thing that I have found so unusual during this time of having hours on Zoom calls, on meetings, and connecting with people, and then finding with phone calls and others that for my white friends and colleagues, it's that sense of, why are Blacks mad at me? I don't understand. I don't understand how to deal with this. Um, I wind up getting a lot of this because I do a fair amount of spiritual work with people. So they figure it's easy to ask the one who's doing that work because she's not going to attack and cut me off as easy as other Black friends will. And so I listen to pain from that end. And then as an African American woman, I grew up in California and my family is there, and here I am in Massachusetts. So their anxiety about my being here alone, meaning no African American family within 3,000 miles, and aging and all of that, I had to deal with holding their anxiety and saying, I'm fine. There are people who care about me. They happen to be white, but that's okay. It's, we've worked this out over 40 some odd years that I've lived in Western Massachusetts. But our real concern was about the children in our family, and particularly the young Black men in our family. And so I listened to that anxiety, that concern, which is historical. I mean, this isn't the first year that Black families have been concerned about what's happening, particularly to Black boys. So it's been such a different experience of talking about hope, which I really, as I think about it now, I've not spent time talking about hope as I've talked about relationships and caring for and holding one another, and a sense of a common humanity. I think that the issues of the last combination of COVID-19 and racism, and acknowledging those are both pandemics that are long seated, some manifestations coming out at this time, particularly with COVID, and knowing that it's mutated in other things and will continue to, but knowing how long racism has been and how much that has seeded and caused the kind of psychological illness, a lot of which, in terms of the denial of resources, the health disparities, and others, have led to conditions of oppression, of racism being manifest in all of our systems in ways that it has been extraordinary, and that people are saying, enough, we've had enough. So how do we hold that sense of suffering and the questioning about enough? And I find that in the midst of the experience of being pulled in many directions and the whirlwind of information, not knowing what we are listening to, that coming back to practice for me is essential. It is in that grounding of sitting every morning faithfully for me, and then whatever Zoom call, phone call, letter comes through, I know sometimes I have to take that pain, that suffering into sitting again. So breathing deeply, allowing myself not to breathe in the anxiety and hold it, but allowing myself to breathe in an awareness of that, and then being aware of just holding it gently as I encounter the other. For I believe strongly still that contemplative practice has an extraordinary impact on the way our brain operates and the way we deal with emotions. And that when we can breathe deeply, we realize that I am not my emotion. It has not taken over the essence of who I am, but I know it's there and I feel it. And that's important, that I connect with those feelings, but also I am not those feelings. So letting that go in practice and then moving to action. So sometimes I've gotten to that point of saying, here I am at this age with this concern medically, I can't be out doing X, Y, and Z, and realizing that there's the word that always comes back, that this is the time to which you have been born, for which you have been born. There is a work for you. And listening to what that work might be in the course of the day. It could be that phone call. It could be that letter from a distressed white friend who is struggling with the fact that she's alienated all of her Black friends and doesn't understand why they're no longer friends. And it is particularly obvious based on what she has said, in terms of her questioning and challenging. So I'm so aware of that shift for me and for others in terms of what can we do? How do we live out of a contemplative space given the kinds of pandemic experience that we're having? The sense of communities becoming virtual meditation sessions, retreats, discussion groups, action focus groups, a la Zoom. We're spending so much time on Zoom, so sometimes it's almost the necessity of moving back from Zoom calls and breathing deeply. And so that's been a fascinating mixed bag of connecting for us, but not really connecting. It's like, as a friend of mine oftentimes said, or a number of people say, you know, the Zoom call was great, but it would have been great to have a cup of coffee after the meeting. It would be great to have the hug. And we're missing that as a people, and we really need that. So we find that using practice to be aware of what am I missing, what am I longing for, desiring to make that connection, but desiring to be safe and healthy and caring for others in their safety and healthy. It is that process of our practice that moves us deeper during these times, and deeper in the way that we can reach out to others who are feeling marginalized and not connected. I'm absolutely amazed at the conversations I had. I called to place an order to get printer ink from Staples, and you know, if you're using Zoom and you're using computers these days, finding printer ink sometimes is a challenge. So I got the young woman on the phone in Connecticut, or no, in Kentucky. And I thought, okay, the order is done. She was very good, found what I needed, order got processed. Then she got into, well, how are you doing in Massachusetts with this? Another 15 minutes later, I'm having this conversation with this woman in Kentucky, whom, you know, in days past, there's no way that someone who is replacing or orders for you would spend that kind of time on the phone. But more than that, talking about her isolation and how difficult it is for her. And she said, you know, I've read enough books. I don't know what to do. I don't want to go out because I can't trust people to cook. I know I wash my hands with my own spaghetti. So she was into that whole level of how do you deal with this isolation? And I was thinking about her and thinking, so many of us are privileged in the sense that we can go on the internet and find a million meditation sites, a million practice sites, and can try and plug in. But that wasn't her orientation. It was like, you know, I'm reading books, but I can't go out. So part of what I find is we connect and share that deep listening when we're called to, even though, you know, I was not planning on spending 15 minutes talking to somebody about their life and how difficult it was, but that's what I was called to for that moment. And that's what I really see as our response. Those of us who really may not be as flexible or may not have the openness to travel around a bit. The sense of focusing on the oneness of humanity is so important. And it does not, we're not going to lose the awareness and attention to those who are suffering in the present moment. And I think that for me is what contemplative practice does, that I can sit in the center of who I am with all of my marginal identities and be very connected across cultures and across ages, and somewhat surprised at the ability to make that connection. And I think that becomes very important for us and our growing awareness of the environment and what we need to see that connection with one sense of humanity or the oneness of it. His Holiness the Dalai Lama spoke of the need for secular ethics education in this country, in this world, and the sense of the meditation practices that would help us deal with destructive emotions as a way of moving to, bridging into, and understanding the oneness of all of humanity. But he also spoke about dialogue and the capacity to engage in dialogue with other. I think we come to that out of meditation because part of it is we have to be in touch with our own sense of who we are on the margins, if you will. and how we may feel hurt, uptight, and upset, and then to be able to listen to the hurt, uptightness, upset in the other. And that's the real call and challenge today. It's the mind-boggling openness beyond boundaries. You know, in Ubuntu, I am because you are, in that African philosophical thought. So it means that I can't create the in-group and be a part of the overall humanity. I must open myself up beyond this kind of protection of I've been victimized on the margin, to be open to the humanity where others may have been victimized and are struggling to reach out as well. I think the other thing is that we gather wisdom from other spiritual practices or an understanding of other spiritual practices. One of the things that I was so moved by is Kedron Bryant singing, I Just Want to Live. And I'm assuming if you haven't heard it, go on the internet. The clip is there. The power of that comes out of the African American gospel spiritual tradition. His mother, as an African American woman with children in Jacksonville, I think, Florida, every morning she meditated and prays. And the morning or shortly after George Floyd's murder, she asked God, what can she say to, you know, her 12-year-old son and his friends? And so she also has the kids structured in a way that they all have their devotional time before they start their Zoom calls and their homework and all. And what she did was came up to the words to the song that I Just Want to Live. And she gave it to Hendon and said, go and meditate on this before you start your schoolwork. And he did, and because he's musically inclined and really sees himself as a singer, he then took those lyrics to a song. Just briefly, the first reading from the first verse of what she wrote and what he sings. I just want to live, God protect me. I'm a young Black man doing all I can to stand. Oh, but when I look around and I see what's being done to my kind every day, I'm being hunted as prey. My people don't want no trouble. We've had enough struggle. I just want to live. God protect me. Just stay right by my side. This is a call to all of us to protect the Kingdom Bryants in our lives or in our circles or as we see them out and about. How do we be faithful to a practice that enables us to sustain our strength and to let go of our boundaries in a way that we become more inclusive and see the one humanity and see the invitation to dialogue and see the invitation to not see this as a time of danger and uncertainty, but as a time of opportunity for a future on this earth where the earth and we can all live.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Dean Jacobs. I know there's been some questions coming. I think you can populate them in the chat, but we'll just move directly on to Dean Hill's presentation, and then after that we'll have some Q&A and open discussion, and then at the end we'll have a very short meditation to close all of us together. We thought it would be important we began together, we should also close everything together. So Dean Hill, over to you.
Thank you, Srini. And thank you all for being here today. It's great. I see a lot of old friends in the audience. Hello, welcome. And thank you, Hal, for giving me the opportunity to come back and have some further dialogue with this group. I'm really appreciative that, after seeing that tape, you wanted to come back and talk about it some more. So that's great. And I also am appreciative of the opportunity to have listened to Carolyn's talk. And I really got a lot from that, and particularly this concept of Ubuntu. And I think there's a lot to be developed there in the activist spaces. In terms of where I am these days, because that talk was 3 years ago, although there are a lot of parallels. I mean, I started off that talk talking about Confederate monuments, and I mentioned to my colleagues that yesterday in Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, Stonewall Jackson finally came down. And it was quite a celebration. And we have this huge street called Monument Avenue, and there are about 3 others that are due to come down soon. So that's an interesting phenomenon that's happening now. The other thing that I've been noticing in my personal life, in the midst of the chaos and the pain and the suffering of the pandemic, and of this upsurge in social consciousness and the desire to stamp out racism, it just seems like such a time of opportunity to restructure both the academy, and I think contemplative practices will have a lot to do with that restructuring of the academy, but also the larger society. And that's really continuing to be my main interest, is how do I meld my spiritual practices to my desire to bring about social justice in the world. And this has been going on all my life, since I was born into a family that was involved in the civil rights struggle. And it's been interesting to see the evolution of it from decade to decade, from the 50s to the 60s, being involved in the student movement in the 60s and the energy that we had then, and comparing it to Black Lives Matter now. It's always the young people that are the agents of change. They're the engines that drive social change and betterment of society. So it's been a great privilege of mine just to be associated with young people all these years as I had that career as an academic. In my talk, I was really making 2 arguments simultaneously, neither one of which I think was fully developed, but I was looking at the way in which contemplative practices have been brought into the academic world. I've been part of that for, again, many decades. And when we started out, we were mainly looking at ways of kind of validating the techniques. We were doing research on the physiology of meditation, or the psychosocial benefits of meditation. And reams of data have been acquired over the years. And there's almost a book ending. In my talk, I talked about the 1972 article that was in Scientific American by Benson and Wallace. And then almost 50 years later, there was another Scientific American article by Richie Davis and his associates, mapping out the neural pathways of various forms of meditation. So not just meditation generically, but the neural impact of different kinds of meditation. Practices of compassion versus kind of a more indrawn meditation, absorptive meditation. And you do get these different patterns of activation in the brain. But I think the question is, and this is part of this upheaval in the academy, where do we go from here? What's the next question around contemplative practices that we can address? And Hal alluded to it a little bit with his introduction to this term, critical first person inquiry. Because one of the things about contemplative practices in their original context is that they were about producing states of consciousness. They weren't kind of vehicles for intellectualizing. And I think that distinction is important, and the ability to have a way to produce those states makes the concepts come alive. So concepts like non-judgment and detachment, as long as it's on the intellectual level, it always is a misapplication of the underlying teaching, which is not about intellectual withdrawal or emotional withdrawal, or non-judgment. It's not about, not being able to make discriminations between right action and wrong action, but it's a larger holding of that space. And it's anchoring in a level of being that's unshakable, no matter how frenetic the times may get, no matter how much turmoil there is in the outer world. One can be anchored to a place inside that's absolutely stationary, not moving. And that's such an important platform by which to engage with the world. And in particular with social action, Carolyn was alluding to this a little bit in her remarks. The idea of othering, that really racism is a subset of this larger tendency that's biologically based. I mean, some of this is hardwired into our brains to parse the world into, friend and foe, or family and other, or friend and food, however it's parsed. But that's a strong biological urge and tendency. And so it takes a lot of work to be able to get past that tendency of the brain, but it can be done. And most of these practices are designed to do that kind of transformation. So the idea, though, is that it requires sometimes intense effort, prolonged effort. One of the things that really benefited me in my spiritual development was when I first started to meditate, I had almost immediately this, what I would now call a transpersonal experience, an experience in which my sense of individuality just seemed to dissolve, and I was part of this larger whole. There was no me or not me, it was just being and isness. And even though that experience only lasted momentarily, it was transformative. If any of you have ever read William James, Variety of Religious Experiences, and his chapter on mysticism, he talks about the nature of these kinds of experiences to the people who have them. And one aspect of it is what he calls this noetic quality, that is the experience itself that produces the knowledge, that produces the wisdom. And so it's very important as one progresses on the spiritual path to be able to have access to those deeper levels of experience. And it's wonderful that Hal, in the way he's designed his program, is giving students that opportunity for practice, because it is through intense practice that these deeper levels of consciousness can be connected with. The other argument I was making was that this kind of background is absolutely essential for effective social action. That you could almost think of it as stages of social action or activism. And most of us are in the stage where we use our emotions of anger and outrage against the other. And so, in a sense, we are reinforcing boundaries between ourselves and the opponent. And so we have to find a way beyond that if othering itself is one of the problems. If we're going to get to the point where we can have this sense of shared humanity, which, by the way, is another thing I think is the consequence of the coronavirus, that we've started to have this more global perspective, that it's almost like nature is showing us that we aren't isolated by country or ethnicity or culture, that there's something that transcends all of these distinctions, while not erasing them. And that's the other point I was trying to make in my talk, that when we talk about oneness or having this experience of the oneness of humanity, it doesn't mean we can't celebrate cultural uniqueness. We can't celebrate the uniqueness of gender, the uniqueness of gender identity, the uniqueness of sexual orientation. Whatever those unique experiences are can be celebrated. But the dominant aspect of our perception is this absolute connection with everyone and everything. So, you know, that's kind of an abstract concept. And the question is, if I were interested in proposing to activist spaces to engage with contemplative practices, what are some effective ways of kind of engaging them? One of the things that is part of this process is self-inquiry, you know, constantly kind of examining where you are in the process. You know, as we develop, as we become woke, as you know, they're saying these days, we are awakening into another way of understanding, but that in itself is also a limiting framework. We have to always be ready to push through to an even deeper level of understanding, even deeper level. So the idea of kind of that righteous indignation, that righteous certainty of our position is something that we need to have a means of getting out of. And it doesn't mean that we become less dedicated to the goal of whatever it is we're fighting for, justice or peace or equality. But it means that, again, we are not walling ourselves off as in a sense of having the absolute answer. We're always a student. And that's one thing that's also been a benefit of my 50-year practice of meditation, is that studentship is the constant, that there's always a greater level of understanding to be had. And there's always something to be learned from everyone, no matter how seemingly ignorant their position might be on the outside. There's something about the interaction that can be useful. So one of the things that I would like to see going forward, I retired from my academic position about 6 months ago. And I was really not ready for the change that would make in my life. I was assuming that I would still be going into the university and still doing my research and still keeping in touch with my graduate students. But it was like I just took off the robe, so to speak, completely. And I find myself now wanting to offer not intellectual discussions about contemplative practices, but these deeper experiences, you know, to help people have a way of changing perception. Because again, we're not talking about adopting a new philosophy, even though in my talk, I was talking a lot about non-duality. I was talking about a lot of philosophical positions, but it's not about the adoption of a new philosophy. It's about a change in the actual way in which you perceive the world. Change the relationship that you have between the object of perception and the subject of perception, yourself. And in that change is where this growing sense of connection to humanity and to the universe as a whole starts to develop. And there are a lot of ways to cultivate this, in addition to practices like meditation. Anything one does, and there's a Sanskrit term called seva, which means selfless service. Anything that one does in a selfless manner are ways that weaken that grip of the ego, that lead us to be able to pierce that barrier of the other and to see that underlying connection. And practicing virtues, like practicing compassion. I think I mentioned in the talk that Richie Davidson's lab was doing this research on how by practicing acts of compassion, you actually do become more compassionate. So all the virtues are that way. Practicing being loving, practicing being thoughtful, practicing being tolerant, practicing any virtue you can think of is a technique for helping to develop that vision of non-duality and leading to this sense of compassion. So all of those things dissolve that boundary between self and other. And it's that process that leads to a state that we could call detachment. And it's not detachment on the intellectual level or on the emotional level. You are fully engaged. All of your organs of perception and action, your ego, your mind, your intellect, your emotions are fully engaged with everything you're doing. But as the experiencer, you are situated in this transcendental, non-moving level of consciousness. And it's like when you're in that space, everything else lines up. It's like you bring balance to all these other facets of your life. So it's not one in the sense of the other. And you can be in that place of non-judgment, which again is not passive and it's not non-discriminatory. You can discriminate between right action and wrong action. You can discriminate what is the dharmic thing to do, what is the duty that should be done in this situation. And you can do it with force if necessary, but you can do it from a place of absolute love, because that's ultimately what non-duality is. It's love absolute, where there's no distinction between self or other.
Love
So,
supreme.
love supreme, that's right,
Yeah.
John Coltrane.
Yes. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dean Hill. So if I mean, we have so much to think about with these reflections and beautiful and very wise words from both of you, which I think are clearly born out of your deep and many long years of service and contemplation. So thank you both very much. Please, everyone, feel free to drop your questions in the chat. Professor Roth will be moderating that with Anne. And well, just to maybe I'll just start with a little bit of discussion. And Dean Jacobs, you can turn your mic on too, and feel free. We can try to keep it more open now. So one theme of the many themes I think that certainly overlap between both of what you were talking about was, you know, this whole idea of, you know, where is myself and where is this other, and not and I like Oliver, you were mentioning, you know, just that othering is the large category, and racism maybe is one subset of that. Sex, all these other isms can be, but othering, just it's the self versus something else, whatever it may be. As a fundamentally critical, like, juncture of consciousness that one must meditate on, one must contemplate that. And both of you mentioned also, you know, the Ubuntu phrase, and I thought maybe, Carolyn, if we can just start with this, the difference that you see between the interpretation of "I am because you are" versus "I am because we are," and what kind. I mean, that's a very, you know, it's a small shift, but conceptually, it's actually quite profound. And I think you did talk about this a little, and I just wanted to see if you could kind of expand on that in this context.
Yes. Michael Ezzi, who corrected us, you know, Mind and Life did a dialogue in Botswana. Unfortunately, His Holiness became ill and wasn't able to attend. But Michael, we had talked about the whole sense, and all that I had read before was "I am because we are." And he said that was not the correct translation. It is "I am because you are." Because the minute I define we or talk about we, I'm defining an in-group and a tribe, you know, a race, et cetera, et cetera. So if I then think "I am because you are," then I move to being in dialogue and in relationship.
Yeah.
And I know I love you.
Hmm.
And that transcends my sense of the we group. Uh, and, for Americans, oftentimes the sense of even trying to think about a we group is hard enough. It's sort of like, I've got enough groups in my life, let alone something that's going to take on a particular identity for me.
Yeah.
But that sense of all of humanity. And I think, as you know, with an Indian philosophical thought, that kind of interdependent relationship is much more you than we.
Yeah.
And so I think, His Holiness and Jimpala would very much have enjoyed, or Jimpala did because he was there, enjoyed that conversation
Yeah.
because it moved our thinking to a very different dimension and out of the kind of strong in-group thing that
Right.
all of a sudden we join in the big circle and then there are people in other circles and that's fine.
Right. I mean, because if you hear the saying, you think I am because we are sounds very nice, we, oh, that's wonderful. But if you look deeper into the psychology of it, we actually, reifies more boundaries, and
Right.
actually that separation of I and you, which we have to accept as a reality
Mm-hmm.
of our, our being, that's the thing that actually creates, you know, you don't exist without the other.
Right.
In a sense.
Mm-hmm.
So beautiful. Dean Hill, would you like to comment on that? Also, that othering and the
Okay,
self.
but please call me Oliver.
All right, all right. I'm just doing it because I know like the students are there. But okay, thanks, Oliver. And please call me Srini or whatever.
Yeah,
So yeah,
I'm
could you?
just thinking about this from a perspective of Indian philosophy. And I think I mentioned in the talk two kinds of non-duality that you find in Indian philosophy. One is the Vedantic approach, which in a sense negates the manifest world, to say that the other, the manifest, is illusory. It is just the absolute. Versus something like Kashmir Shaivism, which says that the manifest, the creation, is co-eternal with the unmanifest, or the creator, that the process is going on outside of time. So it's all there, it's all eternal. And in a sense, that's like what happens with the other, that the other is reconciled with self, and the small as self, in this one whole. Um, so it's kind of an interesting perspective. And I think it's something that is one of the revolutions that might be about to take place in the academy, because the Western epistemology is the exact opposite. It's the analytic approach, breaking things up into pieces and then seeing what the pieces are, and assuming that the pieces are fundamental versus assuming that the whole is fundamental.
Yes.
Exactly. Which, yeah, and we should have a whole other discussion about that, the whole epistemological kind of a situation that we're in, because we're working in that Western model still, and our education system is in that model, and so it is sometimes difficult to kind of make an argument. For example, teaching contemplative practices is something that would be beneficial for a holistic education. It's certainly something that took a long time to get, even at a place like Brown, and so anyway, there is a lot on that side of the discussion. One thing that I'd love to hear more about, I know, Oliver, like, your father was deeply involved with many cases, and you grew up just in that life of seeing the whole civil rights movement unfold itself, and I'm really curious to hear from both of you, just to get a little bit of your sense and perspective of how you see what was happening back then, what happened, over the years, what even happened at Charlottesville the last time you were here, compared to what's happening now. And if you can kind of just give us a sense of what you see as the same, what you see as different, what you, kind of feel hopeful about, that would be really, really nice.
Carolyn, you going first, or you want me to go first?
You can go first. I don't mind. Yeah.
Go ahead, Oliver.
Well, I definitely see the continuity of the movement. And again, I use that image of spirals that, it's not like it's a linear function. It's always ever upward. We do have these fits and starts and retrenchments after gains and that kind of thing. But, you know, the Brown case was 60 years ago, and we still haven't desegregated schools yet. So in some sense, it seems like, well, you could get frustrated and say, well, nothing has changed. But on the other hand, a lot has changed. And one of the things that's changed now in terms of this current movement is the energy of it. And there's this sense, there was some kind of breakthrough. You can feel when something is penetrated and there's a breakthrough. It was that way a couple of years ago with gay marriage. Everybody was against it, and all of a sudden they weren't anymore. It was the same thing with the removal of the statues here in Richmond. Everybody was against it, and then suddenly they weren't anymore. They finally got it. There was something that caused that penetration. So, and in terms of my spiritual life, I see what I was doing all my life in terms of my identity and figuring out how I fit into this larger culture. All that was part of my spiritual growth and spiritual practice. So I see it as one kind of continuous sweep that's going on, continuing.
Wonderful. Carolyn?
I think what I have been so struck by is the number of young people across race and ethnic groups that are out there together and are out there supporting one another. And I think a lot of folks who are older who have been there are just trying to catch up with young people who are on the front line and who are determined that this is not the way it has to be. And I'm listening to people that I know who are dealing with 15-year-olds and understanding that they have a different sense of the world and justice and a different consciousness about that, and are challenging their parents, their white parents, to say, no, this is not right. Could be that everybody's spending too much time at home together. And people are having conversations. See, this is what is also wonderful, is that families are having to have conversations that are very uncomfortable because there's no place to run off to. There's no soccer games, there's no whatever to make the great escape from. I think there's this interesting dip into consciousness that's opened up, because so much has converged together at the same time. And people then begin to realize that this is not working. The system is not working. People look at the United States and then they look at Europe and others. And for the first time in my lived experience, and I think probably in the history, the Europeans are saying, nope, you're not doing good public health. You can't come. Have you ever heard that we could not go to Europe because of our public health practices? All of this is turned upside down in a way. And what I find, because I feel that Oliver, which you will find too, is having been an academic, having been a dean and used to students and engagement, and even with retirement very much, all of a sudden, I am home and a hermit. I sort of wait on somebody to deliver food to me, and, I maintain some connection, but I'm having to think about my own practice and what that means and how that grounds me when I don't have the physical social community around me. And I have to accept the fact that, yeah, I'm going to struggle with this, but it's okay. So for young people, I just wish them the strength of practice to carry them through, and knowing that we're in this for a while. This is not going to be a quick solution anywhere. And the only thing I can say is I wish they'd stay out of bars and breaches,
Yeah.
you know, because the issue of being, it's like those of you who have children, it's like the 3-year-old who's all powerful and can go running into the street or anywhere because the world is going to stop for him or her. We have young people who say, well, I'm not going to get it. And then some wake up and realize that they have. So you've got that going on, as well as those who are determined to affect a change. But one of the things that's been interesting is, I think, and somebody can correct me, that the testing for COVID-19 for people who have been protesting has not been any higher than in the general population as a whole. So there had been this expectation that the protest would increase it. I think what's increased is the absence of social distancing in close spaces. So what we have are young people who are looking at ways to maybe take care, but also to not be shut down, you know.
Dr. Ellen Flynn is confirming that on the chat. That is correct. So
And we have some questions
Great.
in the chat. And I think in order, it's Jillian, Jacob, and then Beth. So
yeah. So Jillian has the first question, and here you go, Jillian. You can ask it directly.
Okay. I was wondering, in the effort to bring contemplative practices to social justice movements, how can we navigate issues of spiritual bypassing?
Spiritual bypassing. Did you guys?
Yeah, I'll take that one.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a very important question, and I think it has to go back to what I was saying before about the meaning of terms like non-judgment and detachment. That spiritual bypassing is the exact outcome of the misuse of those kinds of concepts. That spirituality is thought to be a way of kind of papering over the problems in society. In fact, I've had in many activist spaces, I've had a challenge with things like teaching meditation in inner city communities, particularly in the schools, because the challenge was, well, doesn't just make the students more accommodative to their oppression, to their situation. And true spirituality does not.
Right.
True spirituality is invigorating, and it's definitely motivating to bring about change in the world, but it's powered by love rather than anger or rather than frustration. But it's a constant danger that people need to do that kind of self-inquiry I was mentioning before, because it is a possibility to, misapply a teaching, particularly if you're just looking at a teaching, you read a teaching in a book and you say, oh, that sounds good. The Buddha was non-attached. But it's not just a matter of adapting that as an attitude. One has to do the work to produce that state of consciousness in order not to fall into, there was a Sufi character named Nasruddin who used to always misapply spiritual teachings. He was a comical character as a way of teaching that this is not what you do. This is not the way to practice non-attachment or whatever the teaching might be.
It also helps to be practicing with other activists who can kind of call us on times when we fall into that. In a way that it helps to practice in community. You can do spiritual bypassing on an individual level, in which you can actually, as emotions come up, you can go, okay, I'm not attached to that. Let's go with that. I don't need to deal with that. So spiritual bypassing can occur both on an individual level as well as a social and political level.
Yes, and one other thing I would recommend too is to have a living teacher. Someone who can kind of keep you straight as you are meandering through your spiritual life.
Yes.
I think the other thing is that
Carolyn.
people oftentimes engage in spirituality or contemplative practice, trying to say, well, I'm going to figure out a way not to suffer, not to feel the suffering. And if I do, that technique isn't working for me, so I need to try another technique or find another book so that I can avoid, because I want to live a peaceful life. I do not want to offend or upset anybody. And if I do that, then I need to just look at another way of practicing. So the fact that spirituality or contemplative practices are hard work, faithfulness to it is the byword or what one needs to do. And you're not going to win, you know. There are no gold stars at the end of this, because what happens is the glue becomes unstuck and then you have to go back oftentimes and start all over again.
Right. So we have one more question, another question from student Jacob. You can go ahead and ask your question.
Sure. I was wondering, about how, like when we kind of meet the limits of our compassion, when we meet those people, especially in these situations, whether it's, political figures or people who are, proliferating racism, how do we kind of keep that feeling of connection and compassion for them? Because it seems like that can be a powerful tool for transformation. Maybe not the only tool for change and transformation, but definitely a powerful one.
Yes, definitely. And the way you described it is exactly why it's so powerful. That first of all, you could think of every experience as an opportunity to practice. And we practice to get better at something. So it doesn't mean we start off being able to do this. So so that you also have to have compassion for yourself as you are developing. So it might be difficult in the beginning not to be able to, to control your anger when you see someone who's exhibiting overt racism. Just, you do the best you can. You use that opportunity to practice, because just having the awareness of the emotion is the first step, because it hasn't now completely taken you away. You now are able to maintain some awareness in the moment while the emotion is there. And so that's very important. But you don't beat yourself up about it. You just, each time you practice, you will get better, but it might take a while, particularly with, the most extreme cases. I'm still working on, President Trump. I'm still
Yes, a lot of us are
working hard on that one. But also, you can recognize that it's like, think of it as like weights. That's the big barbell, that's building your muscles up. You don't go to that first. You might want to start with the dumbbells first.
I think so. Perhaps an example that I have from years ago, I was working in Louisiana for about a year, and with a group, I was the only with a spiritual group that I spent time with, and they're all white, and what would happen in the celebrations or food, and it was always this wonderful Cajun food and all. And when there would be this party, they'd eventually get into singing "I Wish I Was in Dixie," and I thought, I got to get out of here, because I thought, how am I sitting with 20 other people, and that's the song for the evening, to as a part of it. When I had spent the year with them, I had gone through helping people plan a funeral, helping people plan a wedding, helping people deal with a divorce, helping people deal with a host of personal crises, because, I was a social worker and I just sort of exude that kind of support for families or whomever. When I left and they saw, part of the gathering and the food, and then they did "I Wish I Was in Dixie," and I thought, part of what I got connected with is those strong connections and relationships. So while that song triggered something in me, I had gotten to know these 20 folks and families in all sorts of ways. And they had been so caring for me personally. When I had a health problem, people just said, "Don't worry about it, we'll take care of you." And they did. And if I had not had that experience, I would never risk having a conversation with somebody I knew came deeply out of those roots. Today, I can engage that because I know the capacity for a relationship. Now, the universe has blessed me, so I am nowhere in the circle of Donald Trump. So I don't have to try and have that interaction up close. But I do have a commitment to meditating that includes wishing him what I see as an important conversion in his own life of way of thinking and the healing of whatever is going on within him, because he is a part of this world and he has a major impact on it. So I can't give my anger over to how do I spend time struggling with that. But I also don't deny the injustice. And I don't deny that things need to change and that, you know, it's going to take the power of meditation and people voting to get that done.
May he have a long vacation.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
a long time to work on himself.
Yes.
One of the wonderful things that I learned from a previous life, a previous incarnation, working with the Canadian Friends Service Committee, the Quakers, is this basic Gandhian principle that you can hate a deed, but try not to hate the doer.
Yeah.
And I've come to understand that there's a deeper contemplative philosophy that underlies that, and that I derive that both from Hindu and Buddhist traditions, that as human beings, we're not fixed and permanent selves. We're constantly flowing and constantly changing and constantly moving. And everyone, potentially everyone is changeable and educable. So at a particular moment in their lives, when they do a deed which is offensive and objectionable, it doesn't mean that they need to be permanently identified as the person who did that deed. And if we keep that in mind and keep that sense of perspective, you know, that we can detest what some people do, but try to avoid at all costs detesting them as human beings.
Right.
It's very, very helpful. And it's very difficult to do that as an intellectual exercise.
Right.
It really, really helps to have a grounding in contemplative practice to be able to see that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Very correct. We have a follow-up from Indy Shom, who's an early contemplative studies concentrator.
And don't forget, there's a question also from Beth.
Beth, yeah, got it. Yep.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't want to jump ahead of Beth. If
No, you said that
okay.
this was in
yeah,
relation to
it
this
was
question, right?
in relationship
Yeah, so
to what Jacob asked and what all three of you professors just spoke about, and I really appreciate it because obviously that some version of this is playing out in all of our minds right now, right? How to approach the other and self right now. And, you know, Donald Trump, I share the same view with. I can meditate about him because thank God I don't have to talk to him. Thank all the gods, you know. But when it's a close friend or a family member, I've found it's been a challenge for me to distinguish what Dr. Hill, you talked about as strong dharmic action, and yet compassion and selflessness. And what I've found sometimes is, I guess, boundaries is maybe the corresponding word in modern psychology. And then the question about it. What I found sometimes is that these questions of like trauma and gaslighting and selflessness and these power dynamics get really blurry sometimes. And even when it's a friend that you care about and that underlying compassion is established, maybe if I can use your example, Dr. Jacobs, if you were in that church and they were singing Dixie, and like, I don't know if you had this experience, but if you brought up that that was not something great, what would the reaction have been? And if they were like, now you're being a jerk, get out of our group, how do you navigate that? And what is the, yeah, I don't know. Am I being a friend by sticking around, or am I being not a friend by not being strong and clear about what is the truth here, as far as I can see?
Well, in that situation, I had to be aware of how they treated me. And what I found is that they cared for me as another human being. Okay. And they had their own particular issues around racial issues and stuff and history and stuff and all of that. Um, but the sense of that compassionate connection as they were growing and struggling with the issues. Uh, so I think part of it was I had to deal with how do I allow history to keep me and experience to keep me from engaging with you as another human being. And so approaching it that way, you know, now if somebody had decided they were going to burn my car and throw me out, you know, I clearly had enough sense that that was not a place to be. But winding up with people who wanted to make sure that I was okay in circumstances. And, you know, I joke about it, but I had the best time learning how to cook gumbo with a 90-year-old Cajun woman who barely spoke English, but we drank a lot as we got the roux the right color and the whole 9 yards. And I thought this had to be an experience for her to be teaching this African-American woman about cooking gumbo, you know. So, you know, it opens you up to possibilities that are quite enriching and transformative and prepares you for the next step. Because I've since, you know, and particularly now encountered friends that who are from the South, well educated, that I thought had worked through some of this, and now I'm listening to them say things in ways that are offensive to other people, and they're trying to figure out why. And so I'm having to say, this is why that's offensive. I love you, but you can't do that. You can't say that and expect other Blacks to accept you.
And Indy, you were mentioning too about family and close friends. Sometimes those are the most difficult.
Oh,
situations.
yeah.
And so you have to work up on your muscles, you know. But as you continue to expand your consciousness, there is an intuition too about what to say, what to press, you know, what to do, when to not do something.
Yeah.
There's an element of surrender too. So when you take action, you can be surrendered in terms of the fruits of that action. You know? And it might not convince them this time, but it was the right thing to do.
Thank you. Thank you. So we have one last question I think we can get in by another one of our concentrators, Beth.
Hi. A lot of my question has been covered, which is really nice. But as we were saying, many contemplative practices can like build this sense of compassion and openness, as Dr. Jacobs was saying, which fosters sort of like this different perception of what is community, you know, what is humanity, you know, what is this we we're talking about, this oneness. And so when it comes to perceiving the world in a different way, to perceiving our place in it in a different way, getting a broader perspective, when does that, I guess, transition into action towards justice? Because so much of a large critique of the mindfulness movement, especially in the West, is that, you know, it can render us quite complicit and quite passive. So I liked what you were saying, Dr. Hill, in your opening discussion about, you know, leading with love leads into action. But I guess my question is, at what point do we know that it's the right time to lead into action? And how do we teach that better so that the actions that we take are kind and well-intentioned?
Yeah, and again, that's the fruit of the practice.
Yeah.
You know, you can teach people to practice, and then hopefully they will get to the point where they are making those good decisions. But in terms of when to take action, take every action you can all the time. What I find is that as I've gotten deeper in my practice, my desire for action has also deepened and expanded. That I want to take action. I don't want to be passive when I'm seeing injustice or when I'm seeing someone being mistreated. but it also gives me a discrimination. So I'm not just responding in anger in the moment, but I'm able to, you know, kind of evaluate the situation and try to do the thing that's going to be most effective. But you don't have to wait. It's not like you meditate for a while until you get good enough and then you can go do the action. Go take the action now, get down to the protest now. But at the same time, you know, continue to do that inner work as well.
Yeah. And that's so important that you do the inner work, because you also have to discern what is my intention in the action that I'm about to take. You know, what is informing this? Also, can I hold my anger, frustration, name it, understand it in ways that I don't create violence when I'm out wandering, walking, trying to take the right action for the benefit of everyone, not just my own ego.
And that, I think, derives from contemplative intelligence, developing contemplative intelligence and seeing how you interact with others in light of that.
Wonderful. So
And you're right, Hal, it was about having a good teacher as well.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And Oliver, you know, I think that whole sense of, I
say
can't
that.
do this alone. I can't
Yes.
do this alone.
Can't thank our teachers enough. I mean, I studied with Professor Roth like 25 years ago, so he was my first contemplative studies teacher.
Savior of education, all you guys.
So at this point, I mean, we could go on having long discussions, but let us close together. Oliver was going to lead us through a 10-minute meditation to take us out and settle this back in, because, you know, a lot of things get stirred up. So always good to, again, calm the mind. And Oliver, should you let me know when to hit the bell and I'll do it?
Okay. Well, you mean the bell to start or the bell to end?
The bell to start.
Okay. Well, I was just going to give a few quick instructions. Maybe we can just slide into it and then have a bell at the end.
Okay. So I'll here, we're sliding in.
Okay. Very good. So as we've been saying, you know, meditation is not developed as a treatment modality for stress, but as a way of experiencing the depths of consciousness beyond the thinking level of the mind. So it's not a tool for suppressing emotion, but a method for becoming anchored in a deeper level of being, so that we're not buffeted about by our emotions. And this is what gives us the ability to do the work that must be done from a place of love and compassion. So you can start by just finding a comfortable posture and take a few full breaths in and out. And you can gently close your eyes. And start just by noticing the contents of your awareness, whatever might be there already, the thoughts, the feelings, the sensations. If you have feelings of anger, just notice the texture of that anger. The visceral sensations that might be there from a feeling of frustration or hurt or impatience. Don't interfere with any of the feelings. Just witness what's there. And now let your awareness expand to the connection with your surroundings. You can feel rooted to the seat below you. And you can feel rooted to the earth beneath that. Just feel the strength and stability that comes from your connection to the earth. And become aware of the web of relationships in your life and the strength that comes from that connection. Imagine that web of relationships expanding backward in time, all the way to a common ancestor for all of humanity. Have a sense of expansiveness in your inner space. Entertain the idea that there are no boundaries to your awareness. So in this feeling of connection and boundlessness, let's just sit for a moment.
I want to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon, and particularly thank Dean Jacobs and Dean Hill for wonderful presentations, very interesting and provocative, and it's been wonderful. It's been a pleasure. Thank you all. Be well, stay safe, meditate daily.
Yes, thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much.
I thank you.
Yes, thank you for your wonderful questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Better.
Mhm.
I will only be truly content with genuine understanding.
Mm.